Hell! Oh, I'm Dan Drambles, and for a long time now I have been fascinated with something very specific. You know it, you love it, you're probably scared of it from that one time your overly religious school told you you'll go there if you have premarital sex. We are of course talking about hell. Specifically, the hell that we often come across in movies. You see, as a cultural cornerstone, hell is an almost universally understood concept. Yet across different civilizations, films, TV shows, games, and all forms of art, we see these really interesting variations on how the idea of hell plays out. And if we take movies as a microcosm of this phenomena to examine, I personally think that you can look at films and their depictions of the fiery pits and find something uniquely brilliant about how we tell stories, and what hell as an idea even really means. So come with me now, dear sinners, as I take you all on a journey into the bowels of the Devil's Playground in its many visual forms. And maybe, along the way, we'll learn a little bit about what it means when we choose in stories to visit these demonic depths. And don't worry, as your guide on this satanic sightseeing tour, I promise you, you're gonna have a hell of a time. Thank you. Thank you. You're too kind. No, you're breathtaking. Now before we do anything else, I think we have to establish something. What do I mean by hell? What even is hell anyway? Seems obvious, right? If I ask you to picture hell, there's probably already a strong and clear mental image that comes to mind. You're probably thinking, well, it's got demons, it's got fire, it's got Margaret Thatcher. But that's just one interpretation. Specifically, it's a very Western, very traditional Christian version of hell as depicted in the Bible, where in Revelations 21:8 it is described as a lake that burns with fire and sulfur. Except to be honest, even that is a gross oversimplification, as other religions too hold similar visuals and beliefs of fiery punishment in death for those who in life partook in sin, such as Jahannam in Islam, the uppermost layer of hell described as a place of blazing fire, or Gehenna, which is described in various Jewish texts as a kind of washing machine that cleanses dirty souls with a fire that never goes out. And things get even more complicated when we consider that the idea of hell-like punishment predates Christianity and can be found in Greek mythology with Tartarus, and the word hell itself even has origins in Germanic and Scandinavian mythology. You remember Hela, the goddess of death in Thor Ragnarok, portrayed by Cate Blanchett, who everybody had big step on me mommy energy for? Well, she's actually based on the Norse mythological goddess called Hel, with one L, who was thought to be the ruler of the Norse underworld, also often referred to as Hell, again with one L. Point is, you can get really complicated digging into the minutiae and etymology of this stuff, and it's not as clean cut as you think. So let's just say, for the sake of simplicity, that the hell you probably imagine when you think of hell, the whole devil's house with the fire and brimstone approach, is simply the popular conception of hell. It's the one you've seen 100 times in pop culture. So we can all pretty much agree if it's got fire, eternal damnation, and devils with little pointy sticks, then that's firmly hell. But what else is hell? This is where it gets interesting, because it's kind of hard to define. Lots of media features hellish imagery or abstract horrors that seem to exist to punish or forever torture. But are they hell? Is the strange, otherworldly silent hill that seeks to torment its visitors with abstract representations of their biggest guilts and regrets hell? Is the Skinamarink house a home that exists with no doors or windows in an inescapable void forever, solely to act as the playpen of a monstrous entity intent only to torture the children unlucky enough to awaken it hell? Is the strange dystopian nightmare of Mad God a city of death and torture and soul-crushing bleakness hell? I used all three of these as examples because they all tick so many boxes that on paper they almost definitely should be considered hell, and yet, for some reason, I don't think that they are. And what's weirder still is I can't quite explain exactly why. They're just not. And then, on the complete opposite end of the spectrum, something like As Above, So Below is definitely, undoubtedly, 100% a movie about people stumbling into hell, yet it has almost none of the traditional iconography of hell or any of the imagery. It just takes place in the catacombs of France, and feels a lot less obviously hell than these other movies. So why is this hell, and why are they not? Hell, within storytelling, strangely seems to be just a vibe. You sort of know it when you see it, even when it's handled in such a wide and diverse variety of ways, such as probably the way that most movies, and to an extent most live-action visual media in general, portray hell is to not portray hell at all. With hell being such an innately understood concept across almost all cultures, often the idea of hell is enough for a film to be in some way about hell. You don't need to show hell for hell to be scary, because of the implications. In fact, lots of films that have the word in the title, and in some way have the room downstairs as a central focal point in their narrative, don't actually feature it. Jason Goes to Hell, the terrible, body-swapping 9th film in the Friday the 13th series, has an admittedly really cool visual where Jason is pulled into hell by demonic hands, but that's right at the end of the movie and we never see hell itself. Hellraiser, the iconic Clive Barker story, features beings of pain from another dimension built entirely on the promise of eternal suffering, but we wouldn't visually visit that dimension until the second movie, and in the first, it is just implied to exist. And one of the most famous hell-focused movies is Sam Raimi's crazy fun supernatural horror film Drag Me to Hell, which, much like Friday the 13th before it, never actually gives us a look at the location emblazoned on its title, and the closest thing we get to a glimpse of it are simply hands pulling the protagonist down into a fiery abyss upon the film's conclusion. By extension, all religious-themed horror exists in some capacity with hell as an abstract and existential threat. Within the Conjuring universe, the presence of demons, possessions, and hauntings, which must be combated through religious means, inherently implies that the great evils in this world come from an off-screen hell, and that the ultimate failure for the protagonist of these narratives would be in some way allowing hell to win. Similarly, The Exorcist sees its possessed child Regan claim outright to be the devil.
And I'm the devil.
And while that's not strictly true, the acknowledgement of this figure and the ultimate threat here being the corruption and loss of a young child's soul once again places hell as the horrible antagonistic force. As well as, to quote Reagan, the place your mother sucks cock. And just to cover every angle here, this notion can, I suppose, be extended to any sort of supernatural presence with religious overtones. Does your movie have vampires? Not necessarily an implication of hell. Are they afraid of the cross? Now we're talking. Why would they be afraid of the cross if God doesn't exist in their narrative? And if God exists, then so too must hell in these stories. So now you know that Dusk Till Dawn was secretly Christian propaganda all along. Obviously that's a joke, because having to see Quentin Tarantino suck toes will make you feel as far from God as humanity will ever stray, but the core thing I really want to get at here is hell as an idea shows us just how useful and diverse storytelling concepts are, even when effectively utilised in the same way. In all these examples I've listed, hell is some abstract, off-screen force that goes unexplored. In your imagination, all of these hells might be the literal exact same hell. Yet for all of these stories, it represents something different. It's punishment for unrelenting monsters. It's the corruption of the innocent. It's the consequence of a good person turning towards greed. It's an attack on the sanctity of the family and the home. It's a cool visual shorthand understood without explanation. It's an excuse for Tarantino to lick Selma Hayek's feet. Quentin! You wrote this scene. You wrote this scene knowing it was your role. What the fuck, dude? Perhaps the best use of the implication of hell, though, is in a little film called Antrum. Antrum is a movie that uses the implication of hell to enhance its horror in a way that no other film really does. And that's by specifically asking the audience that is viewing it to engage with the implication itself. You see, Antrum isn't really a film, it's a fake. The film is actually Antrum, the deadliest film ever made, which is a documentary about Antrum, a supposedly cursed movie lost to time, now unearthed by a documentary crew telling its story. The film begins with various sit-down interviews with real people, who collectively tell the tale of this bizarre lost little flick, supposedly originally released in 1979, which little is known about, other than the fact that every time it is screened, it is surrounded by bizarre tragedies. The tale goes that the film was submitted to various festivals where it would be rejected for presentation. Afterwards, each of the festival directors would go on to suddenly die. Later, the film would be finally shown in Budapest, only for the movie theatre displaying it to burn down during its screening, in a series of unexplainable fires that took the lives of all in attendance, followed by one more final screening years later in California that resulted in a riot in which a pregnant woman was killed. The film was then lost once more. The opening documentary segment goes to great lengths to play up the urban legend surrounding this mysterious 1979 Bulgarian film before revealing that the crew making it have discovered a complete copy of the film and are now going to show it publicly for the first time in 25 years. Adding to the air of danger and mystery surrounding it, they also state that the copy they will be showing has been tampered with by an unknown third party, and that the remnants of what looks like a black and white snuff film have been spliced in between some of the frames of film. Then, after a warning and a long countdown giving you the chance to turn things off, you get to watch the supposedly cursed movie. The fake movie within this fake documentary is not just a gimmick, but a really interesting film on its own. The plot follows two siblings, older sister Aurelie and younger brother Nathan, after the loss of their beloved pet dog Maxine. Nathan is concerned that Maxine has gone to hell, probably because his awful mother told him Maxine was a bad dog, so she has gone to hell.
No, Maxine isn't in heaven, because she was bad.
To make Nathan feel better and help him get some closure, Aurelie tells him a tall tale that she knows the location where Satan fell to earth from heaven, and that if they dig a hole there, they can dig down to hell and save Maxine's soul. It's all very sweet in a kind of sad and childish way, but slowly over the course of the movie, as the children's digging efforts carry on, the tall tales start to feel less like tall tales and more like the reality of the situation, as deeply strange things begin to happen and they encounter some less than unsavoury characters. The movie has that kind of grainy, beautiful quality that comes with shooting on film stock. Despite being a fake effort shot in the 2010s, it emulates the visuals of old 70s horror movies almost seamlessly. The sound's a tiny bit subdued, the image a little soft, the fashion and visuals feel very reminiscent of the style and cinematography of the era. It slow and cuts the modern cinema, and even what could be described as pacing issues that somewhat drag the film out a bit, actually work in making it feel more convincingly 70s with its much more meandering delivery than what we're now used to. It's an incredibly convincing simulacrum. But what we're really interested in is what your conservative mother would call the HE double hockey sticks of it all. And it's this element of the movie where Antrum really creatively shines. The concept of the cursed film is something we've seen narratively done before, like the VHS tapes in The Ring, or La Fin Absolue de Monde, the cursed French movie at the heart of the plot of John Carpenter's Cigarette Burns. However, Antrum is a rare instance in which it is not the surrounding narrative of other fictional characters that is the main narrative draw, but rather the chance for you, the audience, to potentially make the same dangerous mistakes those characters have made in the past, and engage with a supposed cursed artifact yourself. Antrum is not a scary movie, not in the way we traditionally think of as scary when it comes to horror. It is light on gore, there's little in the way of traditionally crafted tension, and there's no jump scares. However, having said that, shown to the right person at the right time, this screen here, as that countdown goes down, could be the most terrifying image on the planet. Antrum plays specifically on human superstitions, fears and anxieties. The film feels wrong in a way that you can't quite put your finger on. Perhaps it's just the surrounding documentary format putting the idea in your head. Perhaps it is its willingness to engage with taboos even horror is often hesitant to engage with, by putting children in uncomfortable peril and showing the death of a beloved animal in its opening frames. Perhaps it's the inherent quality of the fakery that makes this film believably feel like a lost artifact. Or maybe it's just its implicit connection to hell that hangs over its entire narrative, both in the documentary that introduces the film and within the film itself. But whatever it is, it's uncomfortable. And it rolls into that feeling of being something you shouldn't be watching through the occasional appearance of discordant and unnatural sounds, subliminal satanic imagery scratched into the film stock, and of course, the aforementioned frames of another, even more overtly evil film, spliced inside Antrum that never offers any explanation of itself. Plot-wise, the film's Implication of Hell is something that constantly arises in a strange, ambiguous way. Though clear hell imagery is never shown, there's this real oppressive atmosphere to the whole thing, to the point that it's unclear if maybe perhaps somehow the children are actually, at least in some capacity, already in hell. So strong is the omnipresence of its implication. The real implication of hell here though, the truly terrifying one for viewers, is the one the audience have in their heads. If you can buy into this film's presentation enough, and admittedly that is hard to do in an age where Google exists and you can just immediately see that the actress was born in 1998, decades after this movie was supposedly shot, but if you can just let yourself be a little bit convinced by it all and swept up in the mystery and the believability of its execution, then Antrum is able to exist in the same mental space that the Blair Witch Project once occupied. That sort of discomforting uncertainty of whether there's any truth or reality to the presentation you're being given right now. And if you get into that headspace, then watching Antrum can feel like a genuinely dangerous thing. The implication of hell hanging not just over the movie, but over you. You, the individual, who listened to all those stories about this cursed movie, all the deaths surrounding it. You who saw the countdown and did not heed the warning, and now, as you sit there, feeling like the devil is watching you, you might just find yourself squirming in your seat and thinking, oh, maybe this was a mistake. And maybe, just maybe, you wonder if hell has you now. And that is why this might be not even necessarily the best film mentioned so far, but possibly the best use of the implication. Within film, there's often that rule people cite of show don't tell, but all of the films in this section make a strong case for the strengths of tell don't show, and this film might represent the scariest feeling of the pull of the devil's playpen, without it even being depicted on screen. But what about when it is shown? Now we're getting into the real meat of cinematic hell. The old reliable devils and demons. Now you might think we'd be getting into some real horrors here. I mean, every movie I've mentioned so far is quite overtly a horror film in at least some capacity. And that makes sense, of course. Conceptually, hell as an idea lends itself to explorations within horror. It is, after all, relentless suffering and torture through ludicrous punishment connected to the sins carried out in life. It's basically the plot of the Saw movies if Tobin Bell was red. But surprisingly, Though there certainly are a handful of horror movies that traverse the blood-red seas, and we will get to them, the idea of Hellfire and Brimstone, despite being the most synonymous with the eternal damnation that religious folk fear, is used more often in visual mediums outside of the horror genre. We see it come up quite a lot in comedies actually. Adam Sandler's film Little Nicky sees the son of Satan, that's the character, I'm not just insulting Adam Sandler there, trying to wrestle his brothers back to hell before they wreck the world and stumbling into several bits of raunchy nonsense along the way. Though the movie's primary goal might be silliness, as evidenced by the head boobs and the shoving of pineapples into a dress-wearing Hitler to the tune of what sounds like SpongeBob music, there is no denying the film pulls heavily from all of the traditional visuals and ideas we would associate with Abrahamic religious concepts of the underworld. Everything is fire and sharp stone, Satan sits on the throne with demon advisors, and we even get the threat of Armageddon at one point. Honestly, to the film's credit, I know it's kinda critically reviled and has a really teenage boy sense of humour, but in terms of an aesthetically traditional depiction of hell, this kinda rules. Like, these sets and costumes are so fun. Look at this guy! Look at this guy! Come on! I know it's a mid-2000s Adam Sandler comedy, but that's undeniably good shit. Another comedy that goes heavy into hell would obviously be the South Park movie, which goes for an even more conventional aesthetic than Little Nicky, by really rolling into the fire aspect of it all, with some genuinely really impressive animation. And it also features the very red, very buff, very goat-legged Satan design that you could probably put in front of anyone in the world with no context of what South Park is, and they'd be able to tell you that it's meant to be the devil. South Park then intentionally distances itself from that same extremely conventional imagery as a subversion that creates comedy. Like, look how out of place this pink sofa looks against the backdrop of everything more conventional. It's the juxtaposition of the imagery that creates the gag, because we know what hell is, and it isn't pink sofas where the devil sits to argue with his dictator boyfriend. Once again, in the comedy world, there's also a very brief but very conventional example in the 2000s rom-com Bedazzled, where a lovesick Brendan Fraser makes a deal with the devil in order to win the affections of his long-term crush. And, well, I say conventional. It's a brief scene and it does have the hellfire, tridents and winged demons, but I'm not sure if there was ever a point in the Bible where Satan turned into a giantess Elizabeth Hurley in a gold bikini. This film is really horny. For a more obscure comical yet wholly traditional portrayal in film, we can also look to Eneida, the 1991 animated adaptation of the Ukrainian burlesque poem, which showed us an extremely conventional depiction of the Devil's House, but added the comedy through extremely silly and cartoonish animation. Expanding outside of film for a bit, we find depictions in all sorts of comedies, especially in animation. Obviously, hell comes up a lot more in the South Park TV show. It's the central setting of the wildly popular series Has Been Hotel and Hell of a Boss. Disney have sent Hitler to hell in comedic military propaganda. To use another feature film example, All Dogs Go to Heaven allowed legendary animator Don Bluth to apply his signature style to this imagery. Kinda wish the mother in Antrum had read the title of this one. Betty Boop makes all the normal indicators of hell look downright whimsical. Silly Symphonies got in on the action with the short Hell's Bells. Willy Whopper doubles down on Satan-based shenanigans. And then Cuphead would emulate the style of this period for its own hell, complete once again with devil and hellfire you've come to expect. Futurama had this hell, but everything was robots. The Simpsons did hell, but Homer was kind of into it. And Tom and Jerry did hell, but the devil was a dog. This isn't even a fully comprehensive list of animated hells, but if I started going through all of them, we'd be here all day. The fact that it comes up so much in animation, though, suggests to us perhaps one of the big reasons we don't see it so much in live-action horror. Hell is expensive. As horror tends to deal with lower budgets compared to its other genre counterparts, conventional hell depictions in horror are few and far between, due to the creativity and frugality required to pull it off convincingly with real-world performers. The fact that so much of these depictions are comedic or even for children tells us the other reason. Hell isn't scary. I'm speaking hyperbolically here. Obviously, the literal concept of eternal damnation is a horrible notion to grapple with, and has no doubt been the source of an almost infinite number of people's anxieties over the course of human history. The fear of hell, the one we are talking about right now with the fire and the demons and the pokey sticks and devil, was after all in no small capacity responsible for triggering things like the witch trials, and I'm sure played a factor in the motivations of various religious wars and other evils. There is even a term for this fear: stygiophobia. But seeing so many media representations that kind of makes it feel all silly is another way I think hell in media points to an interesting way in which people relate to stories. What once was a widespread terror so strong it would prevent medieval peasants from a sinful life for fear of its eternal wrath is now children's costumes. Though the iconography stayed the same, society, generally speaking, I know there'll still be some people who have this fear, but generally speaking, grew up around it. And as new non-religious manners of thinking evolved, it gave us a chance to look at these myths and stories and understand what they were doing, dissect them, and reconstruct them in new, non-conventional ways, playing with the past of our culture to create new culture and art and stories. And I think that's pretty cool. Now, although rare, there have been some sincere and earnest attempts at a frightening, evil, and conventional hell on live-action film. There's actually an occurrence in this manner as early as 1922, with the Swedish film Häxan, a silent essay movie on the history of witchcraft, depicting not only the devil, but having a whole scene that appears to use red-tinted film stock to show an incredibly impressive and practically executed artistic depiction of the endless torture suffered there at the hands of Satan's servants. We also got some early Hellfire and Brimstone visuals from Italy, when Maciste, a Hercules kind of strongman-like figure who often appeared as a recurring character in Italian cinema, plunged into its depths in the impressive as hell, if you'll pardon the pun, 1925 film Maciste all'Inferno, and then again in a 1962 film of the same name with a completely unrelated plot. Much later, as technology evolved, we had a few more earnest depictions of the wrath of hell. The dawn of CGI made it easier to execute this believably, and so a superhero action horror adjacent film like 2005's Constantine was able to take a few minutes of its runtime to delve deep into its apocalyptic and dust-infused take on the underworld. It's an interpretation that feels distinctly familiar to the traditional hellscape with its colour palette and demonic entities, but that definitely takes those visuals in its own direction. Similarly, CGI also allowed 1997's other hell-based superhero movie, Spawn, to dip its toes in these waters. And, yeah! That's sure some digital imagery you got right there. This looks undeniably like a PS1 game cutscene. Some other earnest and orthodox depictions of the Devil's Carnival comes in firstly with, well, a film literally called The Devil's Carnival, and its sequel, Alleluia, The Devil's Carnival. Two low-budget horror fantasy musicals from the same duo who made Repo, the genetic opera. The first of the two features the hell setting more heavily, as the second expands the narrative into the world of heaven, but both depict this fun, campy take on hell that combines the standard Hellfire look with a more vaudeville-esque fairground aesthetic. They are definitely acquired taste films, 100% not going to be for everyone, but I think almost anybody can see the visual appeal if nothing else. The stylized musical sequences and lighting, the Buffy-esque crazy cool makeup jobs, the David Hasselhoff. There's a lot of passion on screen here and a real sincere effort to ambitiously depict a recognizable and familiar concept of hell on what would probably be considered way too low a budget to achieve that. And yet here it is. And it looks great. There's also the Tales from the Hood series, a trilogy of anthology horror comedies which have always featured a very fiery hell in some way as part of a final act twist reveal. These are unfortunately pretty brief though, so there isn't too much I can say about them here, but they are iconic, they are fiery, and they are fun.
Welcome to hell, motherfucker!
Another movie, well, segment of an anthology movie that creatively gets around the challenges of showing hell on a low budget is the Hell and Back short film from Shudder's VHS 99. If you're not familiar with the VHS series of movies, they are a wildly popular series of found footage films that often feature a wraparound story that acts as a container for smaller narratives, each created by different directors and creative teams. The only exception being the one we are looking at today, which is just a straight mixtape of found footage movies with no overarching connecting narrative. Hell and Back is the final segment of this one, and what we are focusing on for this video, as it's the one that relates mostly to our interests. Created by married couple Vanessa and Joseph Winter, who I absolutely adore for their film Deadstream. If you haven't seen that, you should check it out. Hell and Back follows videographers Nate and Troy, who were accidentally sent to hell when hired by a coven of witches to record and document their latest ritual. With the film being found footage, they managed to depict some of the conventional and some more unconventional ideas of hell from a really unique perspective we haven't seen before, as well as get around some of the budgetary challenges of depicting that. The segment is a lot shorter than a traditional film, and the shaky handheld camera work as well as that limited first person perspective means that they can show some really cool looking and horrifying hellish imagery without having to render a whole huge environment for long periods of time. Still though, while this VHS segment is some good scary fun, it is just a smaller segment within an anthology movie and not a full film in of itself. And while I don't want to say that the Devil's Carnival films are not horror films just because they are musicals, especially because I think horror as a genre gets a bad rap and is something people can often try to distance movies from as if it's an icky label, it is not. I'd still be hard pressed to argue that the Devil's Carnival movies are conventional horror films. Horror is the aesthetic backdrop to these movies, and they are far more focused on theatricality than they are at, say, creating discomfort, unpleasant visuals, tension, or scares. It's striking to me that we can talk this much about strictly conventional hell depictions, a concept so innately tied to abject horror, and yet we've had comedies, animation, horror action movies, horror musical movies, horror essays even, but still not a single sign of a straight up conventional horror movie narrative that dabbles in these waters. I am certain there's got to be more than this, and I am probably missing something really obvious, but in all my years of inhaling horror with all the force of a Ginger Kirby, and in all my research for this video, as far as depictions of a traditional Abrahamic style of hell within a conventional narrative horror movie goes, I can find exactly one. I am sure there's got to be more. If you know of more, please comment and tell me about them. I'd love to see them. But for me, I have found just one. And that is Errementari, the Blacksmith and the Devil, an internationally co-produced Basque language film that just so happens to be one of my favourites in the Hellfire and Brimstone world. Errementari is a beautiful, dark fairy tale. An adaptation of the Basque version of the folktale The Smith and the Devil, the plot sets the story in 1843, shortly after the First Carlist War. Years prior, during the war, a rebel named Patchy survives being captured by government soldiers after making a deal for his soul for the aid of a demon who helps him escape. Now, a self-isolating blacksmith, feared by the local village due to rumours of him murdering his wife and kidnapping children, the film follows his run-ins and developing relationship with a young orphan girl, Usue, who ends up in his home when she tries to retrieve a doll that a bully threw over his fence. During her little rescue mission, she discovers the demon named Sartael, the same demon that saved Patchy during the war. You see, Patchy never let the demon reclaim his soul debt, and instead keeps the little monster trapped in a cage and tortures him daily. And, fooled by this demon, Osue helps it escape, and various dark horror fantasy shenanigans do henceforth ensue. Now, I'm not going to run through the whole plot here, but the reason I wanted to spotlight this film in particular for this section is, well, firstly, look at this dude. Look at him. Is that not just the coolest makeup job on a little devil fella you have ever seen? He's a really fantastically annoying little shit too. He's played by Eneko Sagadoy Mujika with a joyous sense of frivolous mischief and cruelty that makes him arguably the best portrayal of a kind of trickster demon archetype ever put to screen. And I think it's important to highlight that, because again, look at this lad. An absolutely annoying king. But secondly, I want to highlight how much this movie embraces traditional stories and the visuals of hell to put together a strangely beautiful tale that utilises its horror to express something hopeful. Without spoiling too much, Patchy finds himself really caring for this orphan girl that stumbled into his life, and their dark pasts are more intertwined than the young girl may have initially realised. Though the film itself is not particularly scary, which, by the way, should not be your metric of what counts as a horror film, but that's a conversation for another day, it is by far the most conventionally horror film I have found to fully embrace the horror of hell and depict it on screen. Obviously, we see some of these visuals from the very start, with the demon Sartael being a clear devil-like being that could easily have been pulled from the pages of Abrahamic religious myth. Hell is real here, and Patchy's soul is going there. The debt will be collected at some point, he's just prolonging the inevitable. And in doing so, he is living in a hell of his own creation, essentially eking out a painful existence as a miserable, despised hermit in never-ending self-isolation, being tortured daily by one of Satan's demons. It's just that in this instance, the demon is just mentally frustrating him every day with reminders of his debt, rather than poking him with a pointy stick and setting fire to his toes. Though he may not realise it, Patchy has already damned himself, and it is only through other people, specifically this young orphan girl, that Patchy's soul can be saved. The hell of Errementari isn't just a metaphorical one though. Although I do appreciate the fantastic parallels, it isn't just strictly relegated simply to the overt presence of demons in the narrative. No, we do in fact, in the film's conclusion, visit the gates of hell itself and take a quick step inside. Now, the reported budget for this movie was 2.9 million euros, which is just over $3 million. And if that sounds like a lot, just to put things into perspective, the reported budget for Little Nicky was around $80 million. And Errementari shot over 15 years later, mind you, when the money would have stretched a lot less far. And sure, Little Nicky has some cool sets and costumes, but it looks like this, and this, whereas Errementari looks like this, and this. It is a gorgeous looking movie for the price it was made on, which is what makes it even more remarkable that somehow, with that little amount of money, the team behind it managed to not only make a film this visually stunning, with strong, almost Del Toro-esque evocation of dark fairy tales, but also still managed to have enough of a chunk of change left over to take a little trip downstairs. The Hell of Errementari is an interesting one both visually and thematically. Visually, it really stretched the upper limit of its film's budget. Yes, it goes a little overkill on the fiery particle effects to cover for its lack of any real scenery outside of some pillars, but it makes up for this with incredible costuming and demon design, parading you with a slew of dirty, damned and frightened souls shepherded by some of the coolest, gnarliest looking visual depictions of conventional devilry you have ever seen. Thematically, Errementari presents us with a hell that people want to be inside of. Sort of. Within the universe of Errementari, hell is a place where the guilt of your sins in life pulls souls towards it. We see people outside the gates begging to be let inside for feeling that they deserve its cruel punishment. And as the doors shut, the crowd runs in desperation to get through before they are sealed out. The idea of a hell where guilt pulls you in of your own accord is already interesting enough, but what feels like creative set dressing takes on new meaning when you think about it in relation to the film's main story. Again, without ruining too much, Patchy will, by the film's conclusion, embark on his own journey into hell. And while this occurs in a pretty unorthodox manner, he actually isn't too dissimilar to the people in the queue. It is in fact, when you take a step back, guilt from previous actions that drives him willingly into the fire. But it is not punishment he seeks, it's redemption. In what is a genuinely beautiful act, Patchy marches through the gates and into hell's depths to try to right past wrongs, knowing full well that this action will likely end with his eternal suffering. So intent is he by this point in doing what is right, a character element that has slowly been extracted from him by a little orphan girl. And through her, we see him go from an angry, isolated torturer attempting to avoid his inevitable fate to becoming a kind of surrogate father figure who does not shirk his responsibilities and debts, but rather storms headfirst into them for the love of another. I hope at this point something is pretty clear, and that's how flexible and diverse the same narrative idea can be in the hands of completely different people. I know not everything I've given as examples here are even considered to be good films or TV or whatever, but that's not really what's important here. What's important is that the cultural diversification of a globally understood idea is testament to the infinite potential and joy of human creativity. We can take the story of hell, this singular, near universal concept, extrapolate it and filter it through the lens of our own passions, interests and experience, shape it and morph it in infinite ways to tell infinite stories. And we are not even close to being done discussing all the ways in which this can go, because we haven't even talked about You may have noticed Errementari was one of only 2 foreign language films I've mentioned so far, the other being the Ukrainian animation Aneda. And I put them in the previous section of the video because they very much fall into that Hellfire and Brimstone category, but as I keep mentioning, hell is a global concept. And the thing about global concepts is they're not always exactly the same across cultures. So now it's time to take a look at how others in the non-English speaking world have depicted their underworlds. Although firstly, we are going to cheat a little before getting into the meat of things and talk about Hades. Or arguably Tartarus if you want to be pedantic, but that's a whole debate and we're not getting into that discussion. A really popular way to depict the underworld in cinema is by depicting the one found in Greek mythology. Although not necessarily strictly hell is arguably a different myth, the eternal torment of the dead as depicted in the Hades of Greek mythology would shape views of hell in other belief systems that followed. Hades is even mentioned by name in religious texts like the Bible. So I'm counting these, because this is ultimately a video about stories and how they can and will change and evolve and build upon each other. So for our purposes, Hades is very much hell. Just the hell of ancient Greek culture. The problem I have that makes it kind of cheating though, is that almost all visual filmic representations of Hades as a place are American creations, which complicates things a little. They are worth mentioning as we are talking about visual representations from other cultures, and in this case we're looking at the culture of ancient Greece, but here the imagery of those myths is being filtered through an American lens, and this is going to have an effect on their depictions. You can quite easily see this, after all, with how it affects their narratives. Look at Disney's Hercules, for example. In this adaptation, Hades, the ruler of the underworld, not the underworld itself, they have the same name, is an outright evil bad guy with evil bad intentions. Kinda like Satan. Whereas Zeus is an out and out good guy. Kinda like God. Now, if you know anything about Greek myth, you'll know that Hades is not overtly evil, and though capable of coldness and cruelty, can be one of the more altruistic gods. Whereas the lovely Zeus here, grade A bastard! Oh my gods, the thing this man is capable of could make the devil blush. So it definitely feels like they're filtering these myths through a more traditional kind of heaven and hell, God and Satan parallel lens. The remake of Clash of the Titans also does this, as does its sequel. Percy Jackson has an evil Hades in its movie adaptation that's basically the devil. But you know, we're not here to talk about changes to myth. This is all just being pointed out as an indicator of clear artistic license being taken with them. Which, to be fair, everything mentioned so far has done that to varying extents. All of these narratives are all about taking artistic licenses with pre-existing concepts. It's just particularly noteworthy as a disclaimer here, because this chapter of the video is about depictions of hell in other cultures, but this isn't really another culture's interpretation. It's someone else's interpretation of that culture's interpretation, which is different. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that here, it just would have felt real weird to go, okay guys, enough of Hollywood, now we're going to look at other cultures. So there's this little studio you might not have heard of. They're called Disney. But yeah, it's weird. It's really difficult to find non-American visual depictions of ancient Greek hell. And I guess that's just because Hollywood is where the budgets are to pull off such a thing. But either way, one thing that is cool is that despite appearing through an American lens, Hades never looks like an American hell. There is an almost universally agreed upon look to Hades now. If hell is Pokemon Red, Hades is Pokemon Blue. Hades is depicted as a lot shadowier and cold feeling. Less fire, more mist, less magma, more rivers. And although there are very few depictions of this on screen, when it is shown, this is always the look it kind of has now. And depictions often pull from the original myths by featuring iconography like the river Styx. I think this is genuinely because of the Disney film, which is not only the best depiction of this aesthetic, because oh my god, look at it, but it is also the first of this kind, and sort of set the blueprint for things moving forward. This is why the Hades of the webtoon lore Olympus features these deep colourful blues. It's why the Hades of the Percy Jackson TV show is this foggy greyish blue construction of jagged blocky architecture. Generally, all visual media now follows this template. There are a couple of exceptions. The animated Wonder Woman movie goes for a midpoint between this and a more conventional hell, combining the fiery reds we are used to with more Greek architectural design. And then there's the often forgotten animated Sinbad movie, in which the goddess of discord Eris, who I am sure you all have completely normal feelings about, asks Sinbad to steal a MacGuffin in the form of a legendary book and take it to Tartarus for her. Tartarus being either another name for Hades or a whole other hell unto itself, depending on which stories you look at. Sinbad eventually arrives in Tartarus, and the film depicts it as a sort of barren wasteland of rapidly shifting sands and ancient ruins, populated by monsters made of starry nights, all sat under a perpetual dark blue sky. It's again only a short scene, but creatively speaking, it's a very cool and unique interpretation. There's actually lots of really cool visuals in this honestly quite underrated film. And since this is the internet, I feel like I have to add that no, not all of them are Eris. Stop being horny for the cartoon girl. Now I've spent way too long on Hades and Tartarus through a Western lens, so let's get to actual other cultures' takes on hell now. Starting with probably one of the bleakest, cruelest, darkest takes of them all in the Turkish film Baskin. Baskin follows 5 Turkish policemen who receive a call for backup during an incident in a nearby village. On the way there, the driver sees a bloodied man in the middle of the road and swerves to avoid him, crashing their vehicle. The 5 men then wake up and find themselves right by the village they were called to, and despite warnings from some strange locals, they continue onto the scene. Arriving at an old police station, the men are quick to find themselves in what can only be described as a hideous, gory nightmare. Baskin wastes little time in establishing a hell that is far worse than the fiery pits you might think of. Instead, hell in Baskin is just pure, unrelenting evil. An oppressive, derelict building full of strange, dangerous residents who want absolutely nothing more than to maim and torture you in a kind of ritualistic manner. I can't actually hang on this movie too long, simply because there is very little of it that I can show on screen. This thing has all of the gore of the most violent old Italian giallo movie, albeit with the grimy, stomach-churning realistic depictions of something akin to Saw or Hostel. But what I will say is, although Baskin might be a little light on plot, it is undeniably effective in showing a hell that genuinely seems like the single worst possible thing imaginable. A huge chunk of the second half of this movie is legitimately just dedicated to these men being tied up and mutilated as a cult leader like Tormenta tells them, hell is not a place you go to, you carry hell with you at all times. You carry it inside you. I am not versed enough in Turkish culture to know exactly how much of Baskin's world is being informed by its cultural roots, but there were signs that even as a layman, I recognise seemed to be pointing to its influences. For example, the presence of frogs in significant numbers during the early sections of this film seemed to act as some kind of bad omen. I later discovered apparently the film is rife with Zoroastrianism symbolism, and within that religion, frogs are considered Kraftstra. That is to say, animals that were considered to have been created by the evil spirit Angra Mainyu. There's also apparently a Turkish superstition that looking in a mirror at night is a bad omen, which of course one of our police officers does just before seeing his first frog. And the group also crash their van just before a bridge, the crossing of which marks a turning point in the movie where things really start to go wrong. And in Zoroastrianism, there is a belief in something called the Shinvat Bridge, which is a physical bridge that separates the world of the living from the land of the dead. The nature of the bridge and where it leads its travellers to being different depending on how they act in life. And these policemen don't seem like nice people, to be honest. So it kind of makes sense how they end up here. If we stick on the line of Zoroastrianism, that religion believes in a hell known as the Duzak, which is described as a deep, dark, stinking, and extremely narrow well. While the hell of Baskin is not a well, they definitely seem to adapt the deep, dark, and narrow component with the claustrophobic walls of this viscera-covered police station. I can't imagine this place smells all that nice too, so let's add stink into the list. There's no doubt lots of cultural references I'm missing too, but all this is to say you can see how hell can manifest artistically in completely different ways when taking into account the different cultural backgrounds of the teams crafting its ideas visually. Speaking of, let's move over now to East Asia, starting with the wildly popular South Korean action fantasy Along with the Gods. Now you might not have heard of this movie if you are in the English speaking world, but this film was the third highest grossing domestic movie in South Korean cinema history. Shit's quite a big deal. Adapted from the webtoon of the same name, Along with the Gods is a duology of films shot as one but released as two, and oh my goodness, almost every bit of this thing is set in hell, and what a totally different take on hell it is to what us in the West are used to. Along with the Gods narratively takes inspiration from Buddhist texts and paintings of the 10 Kings of Hell. Buddhist literature described a purgatory-esque hell in which a 3-year journey for the dead takes place. Every 7 days after death, the deceased would stand in front of one of the Kings of Hell in a court-like trial where they would make their case as to why they deserved the King's mercy. The King would then look at this person's life and the weight of their sins and dish out an appropriate punishment. The more severe a person's sins, the greater the torture they would endure. This process would continue until the 7th king on the 49th day, at which point the wait to see the 8th, 9th and 10th king would grow exponentially bigger, and to be reborn, the deceased would have to successfully negotiate passage through these 10 courts. This cultural inspiration allows, along with the gods, to create something visually totally different to just about anything we had before when it comes to hell in cinema. The big budget fantasy action blockbuster portrays a hell that is genuinely epic in scale, full of elaborate costumes, varied environments and sets, and intense, torturous trials on a mythological level. As the film follows recently deceased firefighter Hong making his way through the courts of hell along with the assistance of 3 guardians who treat him as their defendant in the trials, you are basically taken through a whistle-stop tour of imaginative worlds and punishments, each with their own unique visual design. There's a world of glass and mirrors that shatter with the souls of the deceased. There's a bright sunlit waterfall at the bottom of which spins a roller which crushes the bones of sinners and pushes them into an ocean full of carnivorous fish. We even get a hint of something more in line with the hell pop culture has led us to expect in a darker world of fire and stone. But even still, the courtroom-like structure of this reality, as well as the designs and costumes of those who rule it, place it firmly in the territory of its cultural background and not within the Abrahamic religious ideologies. It is quite a melodramatic story, but the spectacle alone and the complete separation from familiar concepts of hell make it worth the watch. And it is probably by far the most extravagant version of hell that I will feature in this video, and probably that there ever has been on screen. And next, we have Japan's efforts with the 1960 cult classic Jigoku, which is equally as creative and unique in its explorations of the underworld as along with the gods, and particularly shocking and ambitious for the time period it was made. Jigoku is a horror film about a young lad named Shiro, who has a really dodgy friend called Tomiro, and quite frankly, I do not understand why he hangs out with this man. That dude is bad news. On a drive home one night, Tomiro runs over a Yakuza member and he and Shiro abandon the scene, setting in motion a sequence of events that slowly unravels Shiro's world. The victim's mother and girlfriend seek revenge. The guilt of his inaction butterfly effects into Shiro putting his fiancée Yukiko into a car that crashes. The girl's parents commit suicide. It all goes a bit south for everyone. The first half of the movie introduces all of the characters and their interconnected web of sadness before killing literally everyone off in some manner, and then spending the second half of the film following them navigating the depths of hell. Once again, much like the previous film, the hell of Jigoku is far more informed by Buddhist influences than Christian concepts. We see the Sanzu River that souls must cross into the afterlife. We meet Lord Enma, the king of hell, who bestows judgment upon Shiro for his sins. The characters are tortured repeatedly by Oni, troll-like beings of Japanese folklore. Visually, it utilises a lot more colour hues than just reds, dabbling in blues and stark whites, blacks and touches of green, and it uses this colour palette with strong, striking contrasts to paint these surreal, dreamlike hellscapes that are at times as strangely beautiful as they are shockingly gory for the period in which the film was released. In one moment, a character might be sawn in half, or an Oni might knock out their teeth just so they can grow them back to be knocked out again. Others will be boiled alive or mutilated, but these moments of violence are always broken up by a kind of surreal visual poetry. This film has some of my favourite shots in cinema. This image of hands reaching up from the charred earth, or Shiro running across this misty landscape of outstretched limbs and buried heads, is so stunning. I also love this image of a kind of circle pit of tortured souls, just this crowd of spinning anguish and one character trying to make his way through all the chaos and confusion. It's gorgeous, and I honestly think highly influential. I don't know for certain that this hand shot was the first instance of this kind of imagery in a film, but I feel like this execution of it is one that's been emulated a lot since then in everything from film to adverts to even WWE with this incredible Undertaker entrance. There's also, I've just discovered late into making this video, a 1999 Japanese film I'm certain was probably influenced by this, also called Jigoku. Created by cult director Teruo Ishii, it's pretty wild and actually uses a real-life doomsday cult and terror attack as the basis of its plot, imagining the perpetrators and their lawyers facing trial in hell. Its hell too is colourful and full of similar cultural elements and plenty of gore. Though the plot is totally unrelated to the 1960 effort, I'd be surprised if the original Jigoku wasn't an inspiration here. It's a surreal and unusual film with a strange pace and odd characterizations and plotting, but it's deeply fascinating in terms of the imagery they were able to accomplish, and there's really nothing else like it. Now I know with other segments I've done a little headliner film section to kind of top them off, but I won't do that here because while it's one thing to compare films kind of utilising the same visual tropes and point out your favourite example of it, it feels weird to make any sort of definitive statement about movies across cultures and say, oh yeah, South Korea has a better visual hell than Japan ever did. But there is one more foreign language film I want to talk about, and it complicates things. Okay, so real early in this video, I defined the popular depiction of hell as a Christian religious one. And that's not entirely true. But I wasn't about to get into that conversation until now. The thing is, the Bible only actually describes hell a handful of times. And we don't really get that much of an impression of it. Lake of fire, lots of darkness, gnashing teeth. That's about as clear a picture as we have of the place from the book. But the punishments relevant to the sins in life, Lucifer's throne, the little devils and shit with the horns, basically all of the things we think of when we think hell, that sort of came later. It is super hard to pinpoint down exactly how and where and why this was the image that stuck. But one thing is very clear, is that a huge factor in cementing the image was the epic poem by 14th century Italian poet Dante Alighieri, The Divine Comedy. Specifically, the first cantica of the poem, Inferno. Now Dante did not entirely create this imagery himself. His poem was informed by, among many things, the works of the ancient Roman poet Virgil, who actually appears as a character within Dante's narrative, guiding him through his journey into hell and purgatory. In many ways, the Divine Comedy is self-insert Virgil fanfiction. Now Virgil predates Dante's existence by more than 10 centuries, and in Book 6 of his literary masterwork, the Aeneid, he's already discussing ideas of a kind of hell as a poetically specific consequence for sins committed in life, when he writes about the Greek hero Aeneas in the underworld seeing people grouped into different places of punishment based around the specifics of their actions in life. And in a full circle moment, going back to one of my earlier points where I talk about the idea of Hades informing conceptions of hell, Virgil kinda got this idea from the previous writings of ancient Greek poet Homer. Told you this video was about the evolution of stories, by the way. Virgil took this inspiration from Homer's writing in the Odyssey, detailing the punishment of mythic figures like Sisyphus, that dude you probably know doomed to push a boulder up a hill forever, and Tantalus, who is not as well known, but he was a guy who pissed off the gods so much that they put him in Tartarus, where he would be forced to stand in water beneath a fruit tree, growing ever more hungry and thirsty. When he'd reach to the tree, the fruit would always be out of his grasp, and when he'd reach for the water, it would recede before he could take a drink, which honestly just kind of feels YouTube prank channel coded. I can't explain entirely why. We also have the 13th century German medieval mystic Mechthild of Magdeburg, who wrote, "Lucifer sits bound by his guilt in the deepest abyss. There flows unceasingly out of his fiery heart and out of his mouth all the sins, torment, sickness and shame in which hell, purgatory and the earth are so wretchedly entangled. In the bottommost part of hell, the fire, gloom, stench, shuddering, and all kinds of intense pain are the greatest." Which is maybe like the most metal thing anyone has ever said. So Dante wasn't the origins of the hell we know, but he did kind of codify it into culture at large, sealing the work of not just himself, but all those who had come before him into one divine piece of literature so large in scope and popularity that it caught hold as an understood concept. Why do I bring any of this up though? Well, as preamble to our next film, the 1911 silent movie and Italy's first ever feature, L'Inferno, an adaptation of the Inferno cantica of Dante's Divine Comedy. And now you're probably thinking, hang on, but would this not go in the Hellfire and Brimstone section? And the answer is no, because actually, this movie and the Divine Comedy poem that it is based on feature very little Hellfire and Brimstone stuff when taken as a whole. And now you're thinking, what? But you just said that Dante popularized the whole Hellfire thing. I know what I just said, but the way culture and stories and universal concepts evolve and take form is complicated as shit, okay? So quick as I can, before we move on to the film, Dante's Inferno does feature fire. However, it also features 9 distinct circles of hell, and fire is in like 3 of them if we're being generous. Firstly, it appears sort of briefly in the 6th circle, where heretics are burned in flaming tombs. But it doesn't get to be like hell, like hellfire and brimstone and lakes of boiling blood and fire, you know, that hell, until the 7th circle, where within its first 3 rings, murderers, tyrants, and all that kind of violent ilk are punished in a more familiar hell. And then in ring 3, we also have a rain of fire that falls over blasphemers, usurpers, and sodomites. I did not write this. Cancel Dante, not me. And then finally in the 8th circle, we have these little people-shaped tubes where those who commit fraud get placed in them upside down and have their little toesies burned with flames. But this is like maybe 1/9 of the hell Dante describes, and there's a whole bunch of other shit in there that doesn't line up with the popular conception of hell at all, like centaurs and a dragon and a huge frozen lake at the bottom, and Charon the ferryman and the river Styx from Greek mythology, and the Minotaur, and you get the picture. A lot of things that we don't think are hell crop up in this text that cemented our popular conception of hell. So how did the fire thing catch on? I don't know, man. Probably a whole combination of things. But that's kind of the fascinating thing, isn't it? The way culture and stories evolve is so complex and unpredictable and based on so many varying factors and concepts. And the idea of hell is, like I say, such a perfect microcosm of these tiny evolutions and slightly varying interpretations that over time lead to significant cultural shifts. If I had to guess why this imagery really took hold after Inferno, even though it featured so briefly in that work, then I'd probably speculate that with Christianity being the dominant religion of the time, still is even, and so much of Dante's work reflecting upon Christian theology through the inclusion of obvious elements such as God and Satan and heaven and sin, that over time people just kind of looked at the poem specifically through a pre-constructed lens of pre-existing but not yet codified Christian ideas. And knowing the Bible's rare description of hell mentioned some fire occasionally, culture just kind of took some crossover ideas from these two massively important historical texts and just sort of smashed them together. I also think it is a genuine possibility, and this is really just truly pure speculation on my part, that the other reason this took hold over time is we just misunderstood the word inferno. I honestly think that could have played a factor. Inferno, in modern terminology, literally means a large out of control fire. But infernus, the original Latin word, which remember is the language that Mr. Virgil, one of Dante's biggest influences, wrote in, simply means of the lower regions. Which makes the title of the cantica make lots more sense when you are referring to 9 distinct regions of the underworld as Dante was in his poem. I think because that meaning has been lost to time though, we just over the years heard Dante's Inferno and thought, oh yeah, the fire thing, yeah. All this is to justify my inclusion of L'Inferno in my other cultures section of this video, because while we might have looped back round a little bit to Christianity, I hope from this backstory that you can understand that in many ways L'Inferno is such a perfect end to this segment because it is an amalgamation point of so many different cultural aspects from all over the world and time. This is an English YouTube video about to discuss a 20th century Italian movie, adapted from a 14th century Italian poem that was informed by an over 5,000-year-old religion founded in Jerusalem and arguably influenced by a Benedictine nun from Germany. That's another whole debate I didn't get into, and definitely influenced by another poet from ancient Rome who himself was influenced by a poet from ancient Greece who was influenced by Greek mythology. That is an interesting paper trail, and the film itself might be just as interesting. L'Inferno is a loose adaptation of Dante's work, adapting the Inferno section in a fairly condensed manner. In many ways, that's kind of a perfect summation. There's not much more to say about it besides that, except for the fact that it is an absolutely remarkable feat of cinema. This is Italy's first ever feature film, made during a time when few such things existed. A genuine historical artifact at this point. And yet, in practical splendour, it outshines most modern efforts with its sense of ambition and scope, creating a hell that I personally believe is just as epic and grand as the likes of what Along with the Gods achieves, but with a budget of less than €100,000 and significantly more primitive technology. In the absence of CG, the filmmakers experimented in extremely innovative ways with incredible, elaborate sets that depict this nightmarish, craggy mountain of torture. Film was split to create scale manipulation and bring giants to life. Double exposure is utilised to imagine surreal nightmares. The illusion of depth is omnipresent throughout, through the insertion of artificial backgrounds into frames. What you have to remember when you look at this as well is these were not just obvious solutions to problems of the imagination. Film, and to an even greater extent special effects, were very much in their infancy here. Yes, the famous short A Trip to the Moon, George Méliès's special effects extravaganza, had almost existed 10 years at this point, but never had anything been done with this kind of display of the fantastical at such a scale. This was at a time before America, the home of Hollywood, had even had its first true feature. They'd had short films that could be combined as a series before with an adaptation of Les Miserables 2 years prior, but they wouldn't get a true feature effort until 1912 with an adaptation of Oliver Twist. Meanwhile, a year prior, these mad lads in Italy are crafting images of a giant Lucifer physically consuming the bodies of Brutus and Gaius. And what an unbelievably incredible image it is. Double exposure and scale manipulation come together with genuinely horrifying costume design and performances to create an iconic image filled with anguish. The entire movie is full of this kind of harrowing imagery. For something made in 1911, it pulls no punches, featuring excessive amounts of nudity and violent visuals. The whole thing looks like a Hieronymus Bosch painting come to life. So effective was the aesthetic of L'Inferno that I once read an essay by Alicia Fletcher for the San Francisco Silent Film Festival where she cited a Moving Picture World publication that reported the story of a lawyer who supposedly during a screening of the movie stood up in the middle of the showing and confessed to being a sinner, wishing to repent for his actions. May just be marketing, but it's a fun story, and when you see the film for yourself, it's perhaps even a believable one. L'Inferno is without a doubt one of the most important and most impressive depictions of hell on screen. But guess what? There is still plenty more to talk about. It has took us a little while, but now we're in our final big segment, and it is some of the stuff I am interested in the most. The different takes, the non-religious alternative hells, the personal hells. As we've already established, hell is a wildly difficult and expensive thing to depict on screen. And so, what you find most often in visual fiction is that besides the implication of hell, one of the most popular And arguably one of the more interesting ways to handle its presence is to completely go your own direction with it. A huge thing for me that kicked off the obsession and interest that led me down the rabbit hole that resulted in the creation of this very video actually came from a non-cinema example of it, and not even from something I particularly enjoyed. In American Horror Story Season 3 Coven, a group of witches are tested with a trip into hell. Each hell takes on a different form for each witch, and the character Queenie's hell is a fast food restaurant called Chubby's. She stands in a bleached out, desaturated world as if all the colour and joy has seeped from her reality. Her whole existence is the eternity behind this cash register. A literal infinite line of never-ending customers before her. And it might sound silly, but the conceptual idea that that could be hell for someone made my blood run cold. I have worked in customer service, I have rocked the tills at Asda and Subway, and the idea of being trapped in a miserable, busy shift, juggling the demands of a sharp-tongued boss who gives you all the work and then berates you for it, and a non-stop flow of entitled customers is a big no thanks from me. Return to sender, do not want. And it got me thinking how interesting it was that, although a crappy chicken joint has absolutely none of the visual indicators of what we might consider hell, instantly this visual convinced me that it could not be anything else, because I simply could not imagine in that moment of viewing any greater an evil and any worse a suffering. Hats off to anyone working shitty shifts at crap customer service jobs. I have been there, I sympathise. You are the backbones of society. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. And this vision of hell gave me an interesting thought. Though the hell depicted here in American Horror Story is a simple one, it's very effective in the ideas it is communicating, and very much feels like hell. And that got me thinking, and I started to reflect on how I'd seen this concept handled in drastically different ways in other media. And before I knew it, I was sat in front of a camera, obsessively telling you all about them like some bizarre Satanist exploring a strange new recruitment method. I am aware how I'm coming off, especially considering the subject matter, but I promise, I don't worship the devil, I'm just a weird nerd, and I think this is interesting. So let's talk about some other examples, and since we've not long explained the Divine Comedy, we'll quickly shoot through some takes on that. Because unsurprisingly, the poem that is often labelled one of the greatest works in Western literature, might have influenced a few of these. Obviously, anything called Dante's Inferno that features hell would slot neatly in here. So that of course goes for the animated video game movie tie-in Dante's Inferno, an animated epic, which, along with its video game counterpart, is this super edgy, super gory, super action-heavy take on the story that reimagines Dante, the poet, as a buff, demon-slaying Templar knight who has to descend into hell not as the kind of tourist observer the Dante of the poem was, but as a badass action hero who doesn't want to write about Satan, but instead is ready to throw hands with him for the soul of his beloved Beatrice. The game is wonderful in all of its I desperately want to be God of War edgy nonsense. The animated film though, well, without being able to have the ridiculous power fantasy of actually being the person carrying out all the over-the-top action, and only having a pretty bland plot and characters to really connect you to this world, it loses a lot of charm. That said, it does have the merit of the same great voice actors as those who performed in the game, and it also has the unique hook of being the collective vision of 6 different directors, including Disney and Gundam series alumni, who each bring their own visual style and designs to each section. So visually, it can be a real stunner, even when the directors have one hand tied behind their back creatively by being somewhat attached to the pre-established aesthetics of the video game world. Notably, it also got banned in Russia. Fun fact for you there. There's also the 2007 Dante's Inferno, animated with a kind of cut-out hand-drawn puppetry that reimagines Inferno as this modern urban satire, while still featuring some of the more fantastic elements to the story like Cerberus and the Centaurs. I've not actually seen this one, but just from the style alone it looks really cool. There's a 1924 silent film adaptation that weirdly has a plot more reminiscent of A Christmas Carol, but does also feature this absolutely rad visual that uses red tinted film and pyrotechnics to create the image of a rain of fire. It looks more like a rain of blood and execution, but that's no bad thing because that only makes it cooler. There's also a 1935 adaptation which has a very loose basis in the source material, instead following a fella named Jim Carter who takes over a fairground show that depicts scenes from the Inferno, which gets really popular. He then bribes an official to look the other way when the fair doesn't pass inspection, and later the fair collapses and injures his wife's uncle. The poem only really comes up as the inspiration for the fairground show, and as a book the uncle character shows Jim while he is in hospital, leading into a 10-minute vision of hell sequence the film is most famous for. That is so good! The director Harry Lachman was a highly regarded post-impressionist painter, and it shows here with some really incredible compositions and beautiful set direction, pulling influences from the artwork of the illustrator Gustave Doré, whose depictions of Dante's work were considered some of his greatest masterpieces. The praise towards the film shouldn't be relegated to just this sequence though, as the carnival aesthetic of the Inferno-esque fairground show also has a good splash of spectacle. I absolutely adore this devil head set, especially when you take into account the symbolism of Greedy Boy Jim being stood in the mouth of Satan. Fun fact for this one, this was the first ever film released under the 20th Century Fox label. Also, something I really enjoy about this movie is the main character just straight up doesn't learn his lesson. There's this whole scene in the hospital where the uncle explains to him he's on a greedy path and this could be the hell he expects if he doesn't stray from it, and you think that's going to be a huge turning point for the character after this big accident and follow-up lecture, but then he just moves on to the next unsafe business venture of a floating casino and it goes horribly wrong and presumably many people die. Fantastic stuff. A film that is less obviously an interpretation since it doesn't share the same name would be the 2014 found footage horror movie As Above, So Below that I very briefly alluded to way back at the start of this video. This film interprets the entryway to hell as being found in the catacombs of Paris, the real-life roughly 174 miles of tunnel, a lot of it unexplored, that houses the remains of more than 6 million people. And you know, credit to the creators of the film, if there really is a physical entryway to hell anywhere in this world, I mean that sounds like a pretty good place to put it. That's where I'd put my entry to hell, you know, just right by the 6 million skeletons. Just feels like where it should go, probably. The plot follows this Lady Scarlet who enlists friends, an ex and some strangers to assist her on an expedition down into the forbidden depths of the, and I cannot stress this enough, big ass dark tunnel full of skeletons to search for the Philosopher's Stone, which she believes is down there. The Dante's Inferno part of the story comes into play with what they encounter. As they delve deeper, the environments start to get more surreal. Singing cultists, ghosts of missing friends, out-of-place artifacts, an ever-increasing sense of danger, and images of their past all haunt the explorers and lead some of them to their fatal demise. They also pass a point in the tunnel marked with the phrase, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here," just as Dante found on an inscription on the gate to hell. This film's a real cult classic with a very devoted following, so I'm probably going to annoy a lot of people here and say that I really don't like it all that much. I do appreciate what it's trying to do, and conceptually the idea of hell as a physical place within the depths of the catacombs I am so there for, because the very idea of that place already feels kinda like hell to begin with. Catacombs are also visually striking in the way they are constructed, so this should lend itself to a really creative take on hell, but the film just didn't really strike me as all that interesting in its depiction. This catacombs idea was also previously explored in the framing device of the 1972 British horror anthology Tales from the Crypt, where a bunch of dead souls who do not yet realise they are dead are guided through some catacombs in the English countryside by the Crypt Keeper, who regales to each of them the ways in which they will die, only to reveal in the film's final moments that these things have already come to pass, and they are already in hell. The catacombs are just the first part of their journey into the more traditional fiery abyss. I was going to mention this in the Hellfire section of this video, simply for this shot in the film, but I thought it was more interesting to mention here as a comparison to As Above, because I feel like even though they are very different films, I think that Tales from the Crypt is a lot more effective and musters up a lot more personality and variety with a similar setting. As Above, So Below doesn't really even do all that much with the Dante inspirations. It throws demons and strange geography and stuff in there, but it's constantly having to navigate this weird kind of grounded vision of hell, which is just a scary dark tunnel underground, with some fantastical elements, and it doesn't quite stick the landing for me. By the time our lead is running around with magical healing powers, I'm kind of out. After that, the motivations of the characters feel really weak, and everyone talks in like movie dialogue. And I know this is a movie, but it feels super unnatural in a found footage film. A huge selling point of that medium is naturalism, but no one feels natural here. I don't want to harp on this too much. I know a lot of people love it and it's notable enough and doing something unique enough that it's worth highlighting for this video. I just wish they did a little more with it personally. And last in the Hell movies that take big inspiration from the Divine Comedy, we have a peculiar film from the very divisive Lars von Trier called The House That Jack Built. The House That Jack Built is a movie of two distinct plots. The film follows the titular Jack, a sadistic and prolific serial killer with OCD, walking as Dante once did, side by side with the poet Virgil on his journey into hell, regaling the stories of some of his killings in life. The primary plot follows Jack on these little vignettes into his world, each focusing on a different victim, and we watch their grisly fate unfold at his hands. The second plot is the framing device of the walk into hell, where Jack and Virgil discuss these incidents, as well as debate about their worldviews and philosophies, taking in the sights of their journey as they do so. Obviously, the film has strong evocations of Inferno, the journey that Jack goes on throughout the movie having clear heavy parallels with Dante's journey at Virgil's side. Tonally, it also appears to take inspiration from the poem. Jack does not resist hell, and nor is it seen narratively as a huge antagonistic threat, but rather it is more or less simply a place to explore. The fact that Jack will, by the film's credits, be doomed to its deepest recesses for the horrors he enacted in life is almost irrelevant to the wanderings of its chambers. As he and Virgil, who Jack nicknames Verge, take their journey, they muse upon their surroundings, occasionally partaking in light debate and conversations like two old acquaintances. While I do personally think this movie does actually have quite a lot of merit to it, especially with some fantastic performances, Matt Dillon does an incredible portrayal of Jack that paints the serial killer as romanticized in his own head, but in many ways pathetic and inept to the viewer. And Bruno Ganz, in one of his final roles as Verge, brings a huge sense of biblical gravitas with his deep yet gravelly and deliberate delivery. I'd still be remiss to bring up this movie and not mention that it's also very divisive and caused over 100 walkouts at its premiere. It's also arguably overly long, controversial for its use of extremely violent imagery, particularly against women, which the film consistently depicts as really stupid. Although to its credit, Verge does point out to Jack that these are the stories Jack is choosing to tell, and this does suggest the misogyny is coming specifically from his perspective. And, to get back to the list, depending on who you ask, it's arguably really pretentious, often breaking up its incredibly graphic violence and otherworldly depictions of the afterlife with somewhat inane discussions on topics such as architecture and the history of German dive bomber planes. Also, sometimes it will just cut to Jack holding up words like he's in that one All-American Rejects music video. It's a very weird, very Lars von Trier movie, but what we are of course here for is how its hell looks. The hell of the house that Jack built is cavernous. It has these big open spaces that make it feel lonely and cold. Jack describes areas of hell as having a disgusting stench. Sometimes these spaces are filled with water, whether ankle deep to slow navigation up to the neck and pouring in further to make the trek torturous. Other times there's an almost painterly quality to it. The film even going so far as to rather beautifully create French artist Eugene Delacroix's famous 1822 painting, The Bark of Dante. There's a stylish take to the presentation of hell throughout. Slow-mo is employed frequently, perhaps to accentuate the length of the journey, or to exaggerate the stillness of the world around them. Often imagery is presented with a flat, almost stage play-like presentation, such as this shot with the ladders, or this moment where they descend in bubbles, and the artifice of the picture is clearly exaggerated. Surprisingly, despite its obvious Inferno influences, the film actually depicts the ninth circle and centre of hell as the kind of fiery pit you would most commonly associate with the word, despite Dante specifically suggesting the ninth circle was a large frozen lake. It's here that Jack meets his eternal demise, when he attempts to climb out to an escape route, an act that Verge warns him against doing, but nevertheless his ego and hubris marks his downfall, just as it did in life. It could perhaps be interpreted that this potential escape was always to be offered to Jack to entice him into his failure. Perhaps for me, the most interesting part of this hell though is that heaven is part of it. During their journey downwards, Jack and Verge briefly stop in a cavern with a window that basks the whole chamber in a golden glow. Jack looks through the window and sees the Elysian fields. In Greek mythology, Elysium is to heaven what Hades is to hell. Originally thought of as the resting place of a chosen few Greek heroes favoured by the gods who could enjoy their afterlife in paradise, engaging in the things they loved in life. When Jack looks out the window, he sees workers with scythes tending in unison to golden fields basked in the rays of warm sunlight. It's a peaceful, quiet instance, one that reminds him of a moment of tranquility from his childhood, and as Jack realises he can never have this again, that this will be the final time he ever looks upon this sight, it is the first moment where he shows real human emotion that isn't clouded in cruelty, anger, or smug self-satisfaction. It seems then that the greatest torture of this hell was simply a glance at heaven. Serves him right for being a dickhead. Okay, we are finally done with the Divine Comedy. This video was supposed to be 30 minutes. Oh my god! Alright, that is all the Divine Comedy inspired ones I know of out of the way now. So all we got left in this cinematic voyage is some quick stops at the stories that do something else entirely. The one-of-a-kind hells, the unique experiences, the hells that somehow manage to be hell despite looking and sounding nothing like what we think hell to be. Let's start off by rapid firing through a couple of brief but interesting ones. In the 1970 Christmas Carol adaptation Scrooge, the old famous Ebenezer actually makes a trip to Satan's sanctuary during the Ghost of Christmas Future section of the story. And while at first it appears to be a very conventional, very red, very fiery hell, the unique part comes in Scrooge's torment, when he is locked in a frozen rat-filled replica of his office in life, where he will serve as the devil's assistant. An obvious ironic little twist on his own treatment of his employee Bob Cratchit, who would freeze in Scrooge's cold office while he worked to the bone for old Ebenezer. Not sure where the shirtless, oily buff dudes who come into the office and tie Scrooge up with a big chain come into this poetic justice, mind you. But I'm here for it. 1962's Carnival of Souls is a wicked little low-budget psychological horror that imagines hell as an abandoned carnival that the lead character Mary Henry finds herself strangely drawn to after moving to a new city following a car crash. The entire time she feels the pull of the carnival, she is also being stalked by a strange, ghoulish-looking man, who is actually played by the director, and is it just me, or does the way his face and hair is shot in this image make it look like he has horns? Though the film never explicitly states that Mary is in hell, I'd find it hard to interpret her situation in any other light, especially with the final act reveal I won't spoil, but to be honest you can probably figure out straight away, and with the incredible nightmarish imagery of these pale-faced people partaking in a kind of dance macabre through the fairground before giving chase to Mary in what is, even by today's standards, a genuinely pretty frightening image. Hellraiser 2 I almost didn't include because Clive Barker's stories are never clear on whether the location his monstrous Cenobites reside in are actually meant to be hell, or some entirely different dimension altogether beyond our notion of hell and heaven. I'd even argue it leans more towards the latter. But since these dimensions can be interpreted as hell by the people within the narrative, and the title of the movies, and because it is extremely unique and interesting visually, I thought I'd give it a quick look over. So Hellraiser 2 probably has the most unique and complex depiction of hell within the series. It's portrayed as this kind of ever-changing MC Escher-esque labyrinth of blue hues and oppressive grey stone, which I think is a fantastic way of communicating a kind of infinite vastness within the confined space of a frame. It's probably one of the more surreal depictions too, feeling completely otherworldly in the design of its architecture, iconography, and inhabitants. The geography feels off. Horizons seem to exist almost as like these infinite skyboxes, as if the ground the characters stand upon is just floating in nothingness. And the employment of occasional stop-motion animation adds to the strangeness of it all. And obviously, because this is Hellraiser, there is also a metric ton of graphic body horror. It's great. It's all of the creativity in this stuff that is the reason that Hellraiser 2 is my personal favourite of the series. Later titles in the series would also delve into hell occasionally, such as in Hellraiser Judgment, where it's shown as a series of dirty rooms in which you have to answer questions about past sins to determine your judgment. Notably as well, this occurrence of hell is explicitly stated to be hell here. But even still, none of the other depictions in the series had the creativity and budget with which to execute it of Hellraiser 2's efforts. Sticking again in the realm of horror, we also have Event Horizon, which asks the question, what if hell, but in space? For my money, it's one of Paul W.S. Anderson's better movies. It follows a crew who go to investigate a spaceship that disappeared suddenly when experimenting with a new travel system, only to suddenly reappear years later. When the crew go inside, accompanied by one of the key scientists behind the experimental travel system, they slowly discover that in messing with the way movement through space-time worked, that this ship might have took a little detour through hell and also might have brought a little bit of hell back with it. The way Event Horizon depicts hell is like a fun halfway point between the implication of hell and the personal hell. An implication because we mostly only ever see hell in brief, sudden flashes, momentary existences, often made out of the fears and torments that would hurt the person seeing them the most. Like little hell-free samples. You might think this would soften the impact of the depiction, since we don't get the full shebang, just these persistent little sprinkles. But it's this approach that actually makes the hell of Event Horizon so terrifying. There's a tension created by the slow ramp-up of something very wrong feeling creeping its way into conflict with the crew one by one. First, it might be a sinister audio log, or something seemingly wrong with the ship layout. But then the next thing you know, one of them will be seeing visions of their child back home all bloodied. The thing people really remember about this movie though is two main sequences. One, a descrambled video of what happened to the old crew revealing the blood orgy, which is exactly what it sounds like and why you are not seeing it on screen right now, because YouTube will not be happy if I show that. And two, the visions of hell at the end of the film where Sam Neill's character, now possessed by a great evil, grabs the captain of the expedition and shows him what he can expect in hell. And I am also not going to risk showing that here. But what I will say is that these visions take the form of such rapid, quick-cutting flashes of extremely horrible things going on that before your brain even has a chance to fully process what messed up nightmare thing you are seeing, you are immediately jumped straight into the next image. It's an incredibly effective creative choice that I actually think makes hell feel even more evil here than if they just lingered on all of the gore and cruelty. By not really giving the audience a chance to process what they are seeing and just assaulting their senses with quick-fire awfulness, you get a real sense that you just saw something truly frightening and terrible, but you're not even able to process exactly what. It almost makes it feel like hell is too horrible to look at for more than a second at a time, and it's probably one of the most effective attempts at capturing the genuine horror of hell, but sadly, despite being some of the best elements of the movie, there's actually a lot of this stuff that got cut out. As studio execs said the film was too long and too gory, and a lot of the more sinister stuff has become lost media legend, with fans absolutely clamouring for potentially more visions of hell, as well as a known to have at one point existed extended blood orgy scene. Because we are all little goblin weirdo freaks, and this is what we wish to consume. One last fun fact on this one before we move on. The screenwriter Philip Eisner has said that he played a lot of Warhammer 40k around the time of writing it, and that probably became an influence on the story. This is a big deal for some folks because fans actually consider this film to be an unofficial prequel to that universe's story. I'll not get into breaking down why, but it's a popular theory and I figured some of you might think that's cool. Something else to note is that this isn't actually the first sci-fi film to do hell in a black hole in space as a plot point. Disney actually did it first in 1979 with the film The Black Hole. This movie also features a crew that come across a long-lost spaceship and decide to investigate it, and those investigations eventually lead them to hell when at the end of the film they go through a black hole and exit into, well, this. Nobody in the film ever outrightly says it is hell because it's a PG Disney movie, but come on. That's some hell right there. It's hell in space again, so a bit different, but it's definitely hell. Could have even gone in the Hellfire and Brimstone section, it's that much of a hell. Now, I have a couple more films in this section to highlight still, but before we move away from horror, I do want to make a quick little aside that I am aware of Jacob's Ladder. I'm not including it though, because I actually don't think it's about hell. If anything, it's about purgatory, and that is a different thing. No, I will not be explaining my thoughts further. This video is already too long. Moving away from the horror world now, we actually have a genuinely great depiction of hell in, of all things, Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey, the second film in the Daft comedy series about time-travelling slacker metalheads. While the first film in the series doesn't feature hell at all, and the third film shows a more conventional version of it, there's a really fun and unique exploration of it in that second movie. The film first introduces hell in a manner exactly like how you'd expect it to look, going the obvious red and fiery route and giving us an incredibly cool looking Satan. Although it does also have this rad mechanical dragon head, so points for originality on that one. As Bill and Ted delve deeper though, hell becomes a lot more nuanced in its interpretation. The duo find themselves in an interconnected series of seemingly never-ending low-roof tunnels, populated by vast numbers of doors, behind each of which is some cartoonish nightmare exaggeration of personal torment for them, including military school, a kiss from Granny, and a vengeful Easter bunny. Obviously the hells themselves are comical, playing into the gag that the worst fears of these unimaginative slackers are kind of tame, but the surreal nature in which they are executed is genuinely extremely cool. The film uses distinct lighting to colour code each of the hells and give them a strong, unique visual identity. Each of these colours then comes back into play when these three personifications of hell chase Bill and Ted through the tunnels, with stark lighting creating some legitimately striking silhouettes, and each villainous pursuer getting their own colour associated with them. Pair this with the Dutch angles and quick tracks forward, and were it given a different score and the film had a different tone, I could see these images coming across as genuinely scary to the right audience. Also, the exaggerated proportions of the individual hellscapes make Bill and Ted feel small in their surroundings, especially when they take on the forms of themselves as children. It's a legitimately oppressive feeling effect, especially when paired with the sharp angular architecture that looks like the background art of a Genndy Tartakovsky cartoon or the set of a German expressionist movie. Yes, I did just reference the German expressionism cinematic movement in reference to Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey, but you know what? I stand by it. One more truly spectacular vision of hell occurs in the fantasy drama What Dreams May Come, which follows Robin Williams as a man who loses his children and then dies in a crash himself, and ascends into heaven. Meanwhile, his wife is left behind and, unable to cope with their loss, commits suicide, an act which damns her to hell. And so, Robin takes it upon himself to make the journey downward and save her. It was almost tempting to put this in the Divine Comedy section, because even though there's not necessarily a direct one-to-one adaptation attempt here, the visuals of What Dreams May Come feel epic in a similar way to how Dante's poem does. So much of the hell of What Dreams May Come is based on visuals of just masses of human suffering, in a way that I think a lot of the paintings based on Inferno really focused on. Look at this image of all of the damned reaching towards the boat of the protagonist. It almost feels like Renaissance art. The production design of this film is insane. It even went on to win the Academy Award for Visual Effects and the Directors Guild Award for Excellence in Production Design, and with very good reason. The spectacle of What Dreams May Come is grand in scope. Hundreds of extras and massive, out-of-this-world environments are par for the course. It almost feels like a wondrous amalgamation of the many visuals of hell that came before it, like how this scene with the faces in the ground bears a striking resemblance to another moment we've already mentioned in Jingoku. It's a really stunning film, but for me, the hell here that I find most interesting is a more subdued one. At a point in the movie, a character played by Cuba Gooding Jr. explains that hell isn't all fire and pain. The real hell is your life gone wrong. We see the manifestation of this idea in the movie's final act, when our protagonist finally finds his wife, and she is not swimming through hellfire or falling into an eternal abyss, but rather just sat in a dirty, decrepit version of what was once the couple's home, missing the people she lost, while barely hanging on to the memory of them. Hell for her is a world without her family. Hell for her is a reality she was already living. For all of the movie's faults, I think that's a really beautiful and heartbreaking sentiment. Now, a common theme throughout these more unconventional depictions is that of a personal hell. We see it in Bill and Ted, we see it in What Dreams May Come, we see it in Scrooge and Event Horizon, and if I can briefly allude to some TV stuff, The Twilight Zone features both a hell where a Nazi submarine captain must relive his attack on a British cargo liner from the perspective of a passenger he sunk for all of eternity, as well as a hell in which a robber shot by police awakens in a never-ending paradise where he can have every whim his heart desires, only to realise that such instant gratification for the rest of time robs any of those desires of any meaning and must forever live in an eternal and trivial meaningless boredom. Also, The Good Place is a sitcom that is entirely based around the concept of personal hells. And obviously, there's the previously mentioned chicken shop hell that, along with a helping hand from, well, autism, is kind of the whole reason for this video's existence. The idea of personal hells is so compelling to me as a narrative device, as they not only lend themselves to new and unique settings and interpretations, which in turn can lead to a variety of interesting visual depictions, but they also allow the writers of these hells to reflect on the characters of their stories. I've mentioned before about how hell exists as a microcosm of how we can take inspiration and morph the same general concepts and stories into a creation of our own. But that thought seems to go even further when you're creating a personal hell for a character, because suddenly you're not necessarily exploring your own idea of hell, you're exploring theirs, and you get asked all these interesting questions around what would this person fear? What has this person done wrong in life? What is this person's personal nightmare? What is their hell? My hell, for example, is strangers at a bus stop talking to me about Brexit, or Primark, or being 28 pages deep into writing a video essay on the cinematic history of hell with no end in sight. Oh no. Now I think I've covered just about every angle of cinematic hell that I can, but we still gotta have our headliner for this section. And when we talk about alternative depictions and different interpretations of hell, that can neither be confined to just the implication of its existence, nor exist as straight adaptations of pre-existing religious and cultural roots. There is one depiction of hell that, for me, I have fallen, if you will, hell over heels for. This film I am about to explore is, for me, not just one of the best examples of an alternative approach, but I believe is simply the single greatest, most affecting depiction of the idea of hell in any visual medium. And that film is... Now I can already hear the complaints. Wait, The Descent? You just spent all this time with all these movies discussing hell to end on a final film that isn't even about hell at all? You won't include Jacob's Ladder, which literally has characters discuss hell in it, but you'll talk at length about The Descent? To which I say, shut up. You're not my dad. But seriously, I do have what I believe is very good reason to include this as my personal all-time top hell and the closing film of this video. For those of you unaware, The Descent is a 2005 British horror movie in which a group of friends reunite to go spelunking 1 year after one of the friends, Sarah, lost her husband and child in a car crash. What starts as a fun outdoor excursion quickly becomes a nightmare when a narrow passage in the cave collapses and they find themselves trapped. That's basically it. Extremely simple setup, but with, and I cannot possibly overstate this, unbelievably brilliant execution. Now, if you haven't seen this film, you might be thinking, what's that got to do with hell? And if you have seen this film, you might still be thinking that. And while you're right in thinking that never in The Descent is it ever explicitly stated that any of this is meant to be in any way hell, it is my personal interpretation that it is unmistakably so. And I'd go one step further than this and posit that, in The Descent, grief is hell. I'm kind of plagiarising myself a little bit here, as I've already done a dedicated video on this movie and I don't want to repeat myself too much, so I'll just try and give you the core point I want to get to. The Descent might not claim itself to be this within the confines of its narrative, but it is truly a journey into hell. The film is nihilistic, oppressive, without relief. Every step these characters take further down into this cave system offers worse tortures. It is hell in the sense that it is both the worst thing that could ever happen to everyone in the film, and in that, even by the movie's end, there is simply no escape. Both literally and thematically in this film, the characters are constantly going downwards. It's in the title. It is a descent. Physically, emotionally, and mentally, everything is a descent into hell itself. They descend into the cave, they crawl through its lower systems, their physical bodies are punished, ripped and torn to shreds, their friendships are tested, and as they get lower and lower and lower, the claustrophobia gets tighter, the discoveries get worse, and the colour palette and lighting gets a deeper and deeper red. By the third act, the cave barely even looks like a cave anymore. It literally just looks like a full-on biblical hell. This is a physical hole in the ground that the characters have crawled into, and by the time they hit the bottom, it, spoilers, has actual demons in its depths that maim and slaughter our leads. Yes, the film grounds them as these kind of wild, undiscovered animals that have always lived in these places, but come on, the stand-ins for demons, and I simply don't know how anyone could look at this image of Sarah emerging from a literal river of blood and viscera and not see this as anything but hell. The film is a vivid and brutal painting of the fall into a pit of despair brought to life through the physical and metaphorical space of an actual pit. One that can't be climbed out of. Something that, when you think about it, is a lot like how, say, grief might feel when you're in the midst of it. On first viewing, the car crash at the beginning of the film might feel disjointed from the rest of it. It's such a brief scene and so disconnected from the actual main focus of the movie, the cave expedition, by both being such a small part of the narrative and also separated by a time skip, you'd be forgiven for thinking it was just another symptom of the film being cruel to its characters. But I think it is inherently what the film is truly about. We are told through dialogue that Sarah has become disconnected from her friends, and this is the first time they are reconnecting, and that it's a whole year later. What does that tell us about the year Sarah has had? The last thing we see of her before the time skip is her wailing in abject pain on the hospital floor upon realization of her family's deaths. And then everything that happens after that, but before we see her again 1 year later, is implied. We know through performance and dialogue that although Sarah joins the group on their cave diving expedition, she is still very much in this period of grief. This to me communicates Sarah has already experienced a descent she can't crawl out of. She's already experienced a hell of her own. She had descended into grief, into sadness, into despair. In the cave, everyone experiences a hell so brutal, their hope slowly distinguishes, their mental health and their friendships deteriorate. This presumably parallels Sarah's past year. In the cave they begin to feel hopeless. Sarah has presumably felt hopeless for a while now. In the cave, friendships are lost and torn apart by tragic violent occurrences. A tragic and violent act tore Sarah away from her friends this past year. The cave has everybody go through a horrifying and inescapable hell. Sarah was already in hell. And that's why this is the best depiction of hell on screen for me. Because there is simply no greater hell than losing your loved ones. And that is the hell I believe the descent to be about. Without getting too heavy here, I've personally suffered a lot of really big losses these past few years. And quite frankly, my biggest hope for 2024 is that I can see through this little last bit of the end of it to 2025 without having to carry another coffin. The weight is getting a little too heavy for me. You might think that something like The Descent would be the last thing I'd appreciate following those experiences. After all, if this is how you want to interpret the film, then the overriding sentiment of the movie is that grief is the worst experience in the world. It's literally the closest thing to hell you will ever experience, and it is inescapable. There is no happy end where everything works out alright. Everything is just worse now, and it will be forever. That's probably not a metaphorical pill you want to swallow after back-to-back years of gulping it down in real life. But honestly, it's only made me appreciate the film more. You see, that's the beauty of horror for me. Of all the genres, I find it the most honest. There's something strangely cathartic in the terribleness of The Descent, because there isn't a magic spell that saves everything at the end of the day. No last-minute rescue. Not even a single final girl that powers through to safety. But what there is a metaphorical acknowledgement of the feeling of pain you went through, and then a further acknowledgement that says, yeah, that's hell, and it hurts, and it sucks. That's the message I take away from it. The fact that it is also a stunningly beautiful, perfectly directed and nerve-shreddingly tense and exciting horror movie that works as just a straight-up thrill ride on top of all that is just icing on the cake for me. And maybe I'm totally overanalyzing it. Maybe I'm not. The point is, though, that is the beauty of stories. That is the beauty of art. It's whatever you make it. It's whatever you take from it. And what I am trying to get at here with all of this is that hell is a story. A story we have told, possibly in some form, for as long as we have existed. It's a story we'll continue to tell, probably long after I'm gone. And over time, everyone has their own little ideas of what that story is. And they tell it, and they share it, and they show it, and they build on it like the world's biggest game of telephone that the entirety of human history since the dawn of time is all playing together. And we've taken that one seed, that one same story, and we've evolved it and saw it through different cultural lenses and took it in all these brilliant and wonderful and weird different directions, but always kept it anchored to this same seed of an idea, because we understand that seed. All of us, everywhere, have that little seed planted deep down in our brains, a cultural commonality we share with almost everyone in the world. It's these seeds, these stories that let us empathize, let us communicate, that give us something to say to the people we share this planet with. Stories are the universal language. And that might sound like a wild thing to say towards the end of a video that spent way too much time discussing the artistic merit of the 2000 Adam Sandler comedy flop Little Nicky, but god damn it, man, this shit means something. And it means something beautiful. This video could be about anything. It could have been a video on dragons, on zombies, on romance. This stuff doesn't just go for hell. It goes for everything. I chose hell because it's interesting. Because it's a starting point we all know. And because when we look at it in isolation, we see everything I'm trying to say here clear as day. We see how stories change, how they inspire one another, how they cross cultures and continents, how they are told and retold. We have seen hell be myth, be punishment, be joy, be musical. It's been puppets, been cartoons, been sets. It's been tales of love and grief. It has been a joke. It has been serious. It has been condemnation. It has been redemption. It has been all of the things we have needed it to be for all of the people who have needed it to be that. Because at the end of the day, whether you believe in it, whether you don't, whether it frightens or excites you, whether it bores or fascinates, hell is a story. And hell, like all stories, can be whatever the hell you want it to be.